Question: is saturated fat bad for you? Will it cause a heart attack? Recently, saturated fat has been in the spotlight and more confusing than ever. On one side, we have the keto diet proponents who say, go ahead and eat all the saturated fat you want. On the other side, we have the American Heart Association saying we should limit our saturated fat intake. All of this is enough to make your head spin. I am going to cut through the fat on this episode of Dr. Dave's 411. Oh, and remember, if you are wondering where you can find the new 2-day miracle diet, where you can lose 30 pounds and have 6-pack abs in just 2 days, then go to my website, drdavedegatti.com. Okay, well, there is no diet like that one that I described on my website. But wait, there is tons of heart healthy information and great jokes. Okay, Fats 101. There are 3 main categories of fats: unsaturated fats, trans fats, and saturated fats. Let's make this really simple. Unsaturated fats are mostly heart healthy, such as avocado, nuts, fish, and olive oil. Trans fats are simply bad, no weight, deadly, and should be avoided. Examples include donuts, cookies, crackers, muffins, pies, and cakes. And then there are saturated fats, found mostly in animal products like milk, cheese, and meat, as well as tropical oils, including coconut oil and palm oil. For many years, multiple health organizations have recommended reducing or avoiding saturated fats and even replacing them with highly processed vegetable oils such as canola oil to decrease heart disease risk and promote overall health. Despite these recommendations to limit or avoid saturated fats, the incidence of heart disease, obesity, diabetes, and related diseases have continued to increase. In fact, approximately 44% of middle-aged Americans were considered obese in 2019. How is this possible? 2 reasons. First, not all sources of saturated fats are the same. In fact, the source of saturated fats may matter more than just the fact that one is consuming saturated fats. For example, one study of 5,209 patients followed for 10 years found that a higher intake of saturated fats from dairy was associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, whereas saturated fats from meat was associated with a higher risk. The second reason why decreasing saturated fat intake has not necessarily resulted in lower rates of obesity and related diseases might be due to what we are substituting in our diet for saturated fats. It is possible that people might be avoiding saturated fats, but substituting it with something worse than the saturated fats they were avoiding. For example, substituting saturated fats with refined carbohydrates has been linked to many health problems we see in Western society, including heart disease, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and the list goes on and on. In fact, what we substitute for saturated fat matters a lot. In an analysis of 11 prospective studies of more than 340,000 healthy adults older than 35, consuming polyunsaturated fats instead of saturated fats lowered the risk for cardiovascular disease, but replacing saturated fat with carbohydrates seemed to increase the risk. So does saturated fat increase your risk of developing heart disease? The answer is not as obvious as we would think. Most experts will agree that saturated fat commonly increases certain heart disease risk factors such as LDL or bad cholesterol. But whether this translates into heart attacks or death is a little less clear. So what is the data on saturated fats? In the 80s and 90s, the general consensus was saturated fats were associated with coronary disease. But recent studies have had a different message. A 2014 study in the Annals of Internal Medicine found, and I quote, high levels of saturated fat intake had no effect on coronary disease. A 2015 study in the British Medical Journal stated saturated fat was not associated with all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, total coronary heart disease, ischemic stroke, or type 2 diabetes. And just this past June, in the Journal of American College of Cardiology, it was concluded, although saturated fats increase LDL or bad cholesterol in most individuals, This is not due to increasing levels of small, dense, dangerous LDL, but rather the large, less dense LDL, which are much less strongly correlated with cardiovascular disease risk. Whole fat, dairy, unprocessed meat, eggs, and dark chocolate are saturated fat, rich foods with complex matrix and are not associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The totality of available evidence does not support further limiting intake of such foods. So what should we do? Well, first remember, not all saturated fats are treated the same by the body. And what we substitute for the saturated fats can be worse than the actual saturated fats. At this moment, there just isn't enough strong evidence to condemn saturated fats entirely. Probably more important than focusing just on a macronutrient like fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, we should focus on healthy whole foods in general. Now, I do feel that it is important to limit refined carbohydrates and highly processed foods and focus on mostly plant-based, well-balanced diet. If you desire a protein source from animals, I would consider sources that are organic and unprocessed. Yes, nutrition science is really confusing, but stick to the following. Eat whole foods, mostly plants, and not too much. Okay, who wants to hear a Dr. Dave joke? Why couldn't the sesame seed leave the casino? He was on a roll. What do you get when you play tug of war with a pig? Pulled pork. Okay guys, I'll stick with cardiology. Until next time, this is Dr. Dave.